Welcome to today's webinar, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today we'll be talking about, webinar today is Mindy Alt, who is also a research associate at NHC and a co-worker. We are a national organization that provides resources and research around affordable housing issues at the federal, state, and local level. We make use of opportunities like webinars to connect with housing professionals and others working on the ground to expand access to affordable housing. I'd like to thank the National Association of Realtors for sponsoring this webinar today, as well as previous webinars that we've hosted this past year that covered other topics related to affordable housing and community development. Now, before we get started on our webinar today, I have a few more introductory notes. First, let's cover our most frequently asked question. Is this webinar being recorded? And the answer is yes. We are recording this webinar, and once we have archived it, we will send a link out to everyone who registered for the recording so that you can access it at a later date. Second, please note that all participant lines are muted in order to ensure clear sound quality for everyone. However, we will be taking questions during today's webinar. If you have a question at any time during the webinar, please submit it to Webinar Control Panel, as you can see on the slide in red here in the screenshot. We'll answer as many of your questions as possible at the end of the webinar. Also, we'd like to elicit some more specific feedback from you in our Paycheck to Paycheck database and report. We are looking to make improvements to this research tool in the future, and we would love your feedback about what our research tools at the National Housing Conference. Data on both homeownership and renting in 208 metro areas, and median income for workers in 81 occupations. And what Paycheck to Paycheck does is offer a flexible approach to comparing what affordability looks like on the ground in all parts of the country. So today I'm going to walk you through www.nhc Paycheck tool. You look a lot when you get to the research of the resources and tools that we offer, but we're going to see items. The first being our report, which we release in tandem with the database every year. And it focuses in on workers in a particular industry or sector or a particular demographic group. So, for example, in 2015, we focused on millennials, and Mindy will talk about that in more detail in a few minutes itself. So on this page, you'll have areas as well as the changes in the income needed to affordably rent or purchase our Paycheck to Paycheck database. And I'm going to walk you through the two main ways that you can pull information from this database. We're going to start with selecting one of the 208 metropolitan areas. And so data for our featured segment, so we're not going to look at that right now. You can also, you have a chance to change your mind. And then below, you have the option of narrowing your search down to just the homeownership market or just the rental market, or you can look at both, which is what we're going to do. And if you scroll down, you'll see the full list of occupations. You can choose up to 10, but to keep things simple today, I'm just going to select a few. So we'll select child care worker, dental assistant, we'll select a HVAC mechanic, and a home health aide. And you scroll further to the bottom and you hit display graphs for these selections. And what pops up on the screen at the top, you'll see that we're looking at light blue bar worker would need to afford to buy that home. Now this is based on a few assumptions that we make about what is affordable and also what the cost would be to buy that medium priced home. So we assume that this home would be affordable to the worker because their monthly cost would comprise 28% or less of their monthly income in line with standard underwriting guidelines. And we assume for our estimates of the cost that they have a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage and made a 10% down payment. We use the average effective interest rate from the Federal Housing Finance Agency, and then we use estimates for private mortgage insurance as well as property taxes and property insurance to give an idea of what the full ownership cost would look like if someone were to buy this medium-priced home. Now, when you look to the right, you're going to see these 4 occupations that we selected. And these bars indicate the median incomes that these workers earn in this metro area. So for example, a child care worker in the Chicago metro area typically would earn about $29,000. And you can see for the first 3 occupations that these incomes fall far short of what they would need to earn to be able to affordably buy that home. There's only one occupation that we selected where workers would typically be able to afford that home, and that's the HVAC mechanic. But it's important to take a look at what the differences are in terms of the income and the income they would need, and it's pretty close. So when you think about trying to gain savings to put down that 10%, you have to think about not just what workers can afford for that month, but how realistic it is for them to save up for that home. So this gives you a picture of the homeownership market. Now we're going to scroll down and take a look at the rental market in the Chicago metro area. And the graph is laid out very similarly to the graph above. So you see that you are also looking at the Chicago metro area. And for our rental housing costs, we use fair market rents released by HUD to get a sense of what typical rents are on a 1-bedroom home or a 2-bedroom home. And at the top, you're going to see these numbers listed for the Chicago metro area. Now, we have fewer assumptions for what is affordable rents. Basically, we look at whether these rents would amount to 30% or less of a worker's income. When you look to the left, you'll see these light blue bars that again represent the incomes workers would need to affordably rent a 1-bedroom or a 2-bedroom. And then when you look to the right, you see the median incomes that these workers actually earn. And again, the affordability picture doesn't look good for child care workers, dental assistants, and home health aides in the Chicago metro area. They fall well short of the income needed not just to afford a 2-bedroom home, but a 1-bedroom home. And so you have to start to think about what kinds of choices these workers are making in order to find a home they can afford. Now the picture looks much better for an HVAC mechanic, and when you look at the difference between their income and rent for a 2-bedroom, it looks like there's the potential for them to accumulate savings over time towards a down payment if homeownership is a goal of theirs. And so you can download both of these charts and use them to provide information on some of the gaps between housing costs and incomes in your region. There's another way that we can organize this information, and I'm going to take a quick look at that now. So we go back to the Paycheck to Paycheck page, and instead of looking at one metropolitan area and several occupations, we're going to select one occupation and look at several metro areas. And this can be helpful when you're trying to get a sense of what affordability looks like for workers in one kind of occupation and see how things look different across the country. So this time, let's select a home health aide. And you have the option of selecting 3 pre-selected cities, which consist of Chicago, Los Angeles, and a nationwide picture, or you can customize it, which is what we're going to do here. Now, this again is set up to the other page we looked at. You could narrow it down to homeownership or rental, or both. So we're going to do both again. And we're going to select up to 3 metropolitans. So I'm going to try and get a mix of regions across the country. So I'm going to check Fort Worth, Texas, Jacksonville, Florida, and Santa Barbara, California, to get a mix of geography and cost. And I'm going to display these selections. So in this first graph, it looks like there's a little bit of a glitch of an overlap. So you should be able to read that, again, we're looking at home health aides in the first quarter of 2015 in home ownership. And up in the top left, again, you're going to have the median home prices for the first quarter listed for these 3 metropolitan areas. And the light blue bars, again, will represent the income needed to affordably buy these median priced homes. And the dark blue represent the median incomes that a home health aide is going to receive in these metro areas. And you can see there's some real gaps when you're looking at Fort Worth, Texas. Typical home health aide is making a little over half of what they would need to be able to affordably buy a home. In Jacksonville, Florida, the gap is a little bit smaller, but still significant. And in Santa Barbara, California, what we all probably recognize as a high-cost market, the gap is almost $100,000. And so when you start to think about what kind of choices that worker would have to make, it really is clear that there are very few options for them. Even if they double up or they find slightly lower cost home or a slightly higher wage, they have some real challenges. So let's take a look at what it looks like to rent for these home health aides. Again, in the top left corner, you're going to see the fair market rents for a one-bedroom home or a two-bedroom home in the 3 metro areas that I selected. The lightest blue bar represents the income needed to affordably rent a one-bedroom. The medium blue bar is the income needed to affordably rent a two-bedroom. And the dark blue bar is the median income of a home health aide in the metro area. Now, when you're looking at rent, you can see the picture is a little bit more promising for home health aides. When you're looking at Fort Worth in particular, there's a small gap of about $1,000 between the income they would need to affordably rent a typical one-bedroom. In Jacksonville, Florida, there's also a gap between what a home health aide would need to afford to rent a one-bedroom. And in both metro areas, there's a pretty significant gap between what they would need to affordably rent a two-bedroom. So it's really kind of beyond their reach in this case. And then when you look at Santa Barbara, the picture is much grimmer, as you probably anticipated. But you can see just how dramatic this gap is. And we're talking about renting. You know, it's something that people can understand and wrap their head around if someone cannot afford to buy a home. But if they can't afford to rent a home, what are their options? In this case, there's about a $20,000 difference between what a home health aide typically earns and what they would need to earn to afford to rent a one-bedroom apartment. And so this really helps outline these affordability gaps and challenges that workers face. And so this is a very quick demo that I've shown you here of our Paycheck to Paycheck tool. And so in addition to having all this information on a variety of different workers, we also, as I mentioned, release a report that focuses in on workers in a particular sector or a particular demographic. And this year we focused in on millennials. And there's a couple of reasons why. The first is there's a lot of information out in the media about millennial housing desires and who they are and what kind of impact they're going to have on our economy long term. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions. This poster kind of has a little fun with some of these stereotypes that we have about who we think millennials are and what we think they look like. You know, a lot of people envision millennials as urban dwelling hipsters with very niche occupations, but the reality is much more complex. There are many millennials who are heads of family, they are a diverse group, and they are also an economically challenged group. And so their housing choices and their housing challenges have a huge impact on our housing market, not just now, but also in the future. And so at this point, I'm going to hand over the webinar to Mindy to talk about millennials in a little bit more detail.
Thanks, Janet. Hi, everyone. I'm Mindy Aide. I'm a research associate also here at Center for Housing Policy. So as Janet said, we focused on millennials, and I will give you kind of a snapshot of demographically what millennials look like in 2014. First of all, we have who are millennials in the workforce. Millennials currently make up about a third of the U.S. workforce, and that share will, of course, grow as older workers retire and younger millennials finish their education and replace them. As of 2013, while millennials and non-millennial adults had similar rates of labor force participation, the unemployment rate among millennials is nearly twice the overall national unemployment rate. So it's high. Who are millennials living with? Millennials are establishing independent households at lower rates than earlier generations. According to U.S. Census data from the 2013 American Community Survey, 33% of millennials live with their parents. Another 32% are living with roommates, relatives, or in group quarters, and a little more than 25% are living with a spouse or partner. of millennials who have established their own households, about 44% have children. Income-wise, the share of older millennials, those aged 25 to 33 with a bachelor's degree or higher, is more than 2 percentage points higher than that for non-millennial adults. However, despite their higher educational attainment, millennials' income is fairly low. The median income for employed millennials is $22,000, which is just a little over half the $42,000 median income for employed non-millennial adults. The income distribution for millennials looks like this. Due to their lower incomes, millennials are more likely to be housing cost burdened than non-millennial adults. More than 1/3 of employed millennials earn less than $15,000 per year. When broken down by race and ethnicity, the income picture is even more stark. Median incomes for employed African American and Hispanic millennials fall below the median income for all millennials at $18,500 and $19,000 respectively. As far as owning or renting their homes, among millennials who do head a household, about 69% are renters, compared to the 36% of all U.S. householders who are renters. Surveys indicate that millennials still aspire to be homeowners, but many are delaying the purchase of a home for a host of reasons. Looking at housing affordability for millennials, in our 2015 report, we focused on 5 occupations where millennials are highly represented. We looked at administrative assistants, retail cashiers, e-commerce customer service reps, food service managers, and cardiac technicians. We examined 208 metro areas for housing affordability using median home price data from the National Association of Home Builders and fair market rent rates from HUD, along with median national incomes for the occupations. Administrative assistants earning the median income can afford to rent a typical 2-bedroom home in 171 of the 208 metro areas, but they can only afford to buy a median-priced home in 90 metro areas. Retail cashiers who earn a median annual salary of $20,432, even when employed full-time, cannot afford to rent a 2-bedroom home or to buy a median-priced home in any of the 208 metro areas in our analysis. For e-commerce customer service reps, only 40% of the 208 metro areas are affordable to rent a 2-bedroom home, and only 16% of these are affordable for buying a median-priced house. Cardiac technicians can affordably rent a 2-bedroom home in 70% of the 208 metros, but can afford to buy a median-priced home in only 35%. And lastly, food service managers fare best of our 5 occupations. They have a median income of a little over $60,000. They can afford to rent a 2-bedroom home in most metro areas, but can only afford to buy a median-priced home in 35% of the areas. The implications of the unaffordable housing situation for millennial workers. The results from a recent survey by the Urban Land Institute showed that more than 65% of millennials plan to become homeowners within the next 5 years. However, millennials are buying homes at lower rates than did previous generations. The lower homeownership rates for millennials are partly explained by their delaying of marriage and childbearing, and may also be affected by limited job opportunities, slow wage growth, and high rents in many parts of the U.S. that hinder the ability to save for a down payment. Millennials' delaying of home buying contributes to the slow pace of local housing market recovery, as well as to the high demand for rental housing that drives up rents in many metro areas. Lack of housing that is affordable to millennial workers can impede regional economic growth. If workers can't afford to rent or buy a home in a metro area, employers in that area may have a difficult time attracting new millennial workers. And finally, policy solutions. A mix of federal, state, and local policies is needed to create a healthy housing market that expands rental and homeownership opportunities for millennial workers. Some potential solutions that we explore in the report include a system that restores the balance between private risk-bearing capital and a government guarantee that would help millennials to access housing in areas with job opportunities and will contribute toward the recovery of housing markets nationwide. Expanding programs that create and preserve affordable rental housing and increase affordability. These are programs like the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, the Home Investment Partnerships Program, Community Development Block Grants, Property-Based Section 8 Rental Assistance, and Housing Choice Vouchers. Adopting local zoning policies that allow for higher density residential development and smaller housing units would help, as well as first-time home buyer programs that offer favorable mortgage rates or down payment assistance to people looking to purchase their first homes. That concludes our presentation. We'd like to open it up for any questions that you have.
As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, you can submit your questions to us using the question toolbar. And we just had our first question come in. The question is it possible to look at a city's findings over time? For example, comparing one year to another or looking back at a 5 or 10-year period. That's an excellent question, and that's something that we've been exploring within our office. Unfortunately, researchers in previous editions had chosen different quarters to focus on. And so as a researcher, it's a little bit complicated when you want to compare data from different quarters. It's not standardized. However, if you're trying to get a general sense of how affordability challenges have changed and evolved in your metro area, you can certainly go to our website. We started doing this kind of analysis, I believe the first version was released in 2005. And so you can get a sense of, even just looking at the graphs, how these gaps are growing or shrinking or remaining static over time. The thing to keep in mind is the financial data that we use. So when you're looking at the housing costs or the income, those are nominal values. And so you don't necessarily want to use those values because it doesn't account for inflation necessarily, or just be very careful how you use them. But one of the things we do want to do in the future is really collect this data to give a better idea of trends for affordability. The next question that we had come in was to describe who the millennial generation are. And I'm going to turn that one over to Mindy. If you could give us a brief description of who we're talking about when we say millennial.
For this report, we looked at, there are various, which is probably why you're asking the question, there are various definitions of what's a millennial. We took the definition that the Pew Research Center took, and that was adults who were between the ages of 18 and 33 in 2003, which is the year for which we have data.
2013?
Yes, sorry, what did I say? 2003? Mm-hmm. Oh, sorry, yes, 2013. So yeah, we looked at everybody between the ages of 18 and 33 in 2013. We focused on those who were employed as well for the purposes of this report.
And in some cases, Mindy, correct me if I'm wrong, some of the data and the graphs look at older millennials, because one of the challenges I imagine when you talk about millennials is many of them are probably still quite young, haven't finished their education.
Yes, and we did, in fact, one of the graphs in here, we did, when we looked at that, we defined older millennials as between the ages of 25 and 33.
Okay, so we had a question come in asking what our thoughts are on rent caps in metro areas to ease the financial burden of millennials. That's a really interesting question. I think rent caps could be an effective tool. However, they are very controversial. And so one of the challenges when we're talking about policy solutions for housing affordability is housing is a controversial subject, as you probably all have experienced in your day-to-day life and jobs. So I think our goal is often to focus on tools that are realistic in the culture and the policy climate of your community. I think there might be some metro areas where this might be a realistic tool, rent caps. I think the other thing to keep in mind too, which is what we've seen, is that it's most effective to use a variety of tools. Every community, every metro, every region is different and has slightly different needs and characteristics. And so there really isn't a good one-size-fits-all approach. And often it's a real challenge to get one tool to respond to all housing needs. So mixing a variety of approaches, I think, tends to be the most effective. We have another question that came in asking, is there any way to go below the metro area geography? Now, that's a great question. Our database is not equipped to go into more detailed geography than metro area. However, on our website, www.nhc.org, if you go to the Paycheck to Paycheck tool page, which I navigated through earlier, there is a link to our methodology and frequently asked questions. And it lays out how you can actually conduct your own analysis at a smaller geographic level. For example, if you wanted to look in just your own town or even in a small neighborhood, we describe how we conduct our analysis and the methodology. So if you can collect housing price data for home buying or for renting in the community of your interest, and if you can collect some incomes data as well, you can conduct this kind of analysis yourself at a very small geography. We had a question come in on whether there's data available for other metropolitan areas. We have data on 208 metropolitan areas, so we aren't able to cover all of the MSAs across the country, but this gives you a little bit of an entree point. Again, if you want to conduct your own analysis, we have some guidance on the kinds of data that you would want to collect. Okay, and then we had a great suggestion come in mentioning that Jason Furman, the head of the Council of Economic Advisors, gave a recent speech on how zoning and other restrictive covenants can limit affordability, along with a link. So what we can do is actually share that when we send out our follow-up email in case people are interested in how zoning impacts housing affordability. That's certainly a really critical component, as Mindy mentioned, in many communities that can really affect not just the overall supply of affordable housing, but also the kinds of housing that's available, particularly when you're thinking about millennials and the kind of housing they need. It's a real mix. As Mindy mentioned, there are many millennials that have already started families and are looking for units that are large enough to accommodate their family. We had another question come in asking, what about couples looking to rent or purchase? And that's another great question. In our analysis, we start off focusing on just single worker households. However, you can do your own kind of back-of-the-envelope calculations of whether there were two workers. So we give you the median incomes for different occupations. And sometimes it can be instructive to think about, well, hypothetically, what if you had a teacher and a fireman in one household? What would their affordability look like? And so you can't do that in our graphs currently. However, that might be a great thing for us to look into in the future, is creating different kinds of household compositions where you can play around with what it looks like when you have multiple workers and contributing to the household income and what affordability looks like in that case.
Also, the supplement that we publish alongside this goes into it. Part of what it does is it looks at three snapshots, three hypothetical families with different, and I think two of them have two-worker households, and it shows, this is what it looks like for one partner with this occupation, one partner with this occupation, and it kind of breaks down what their budget looks like, if they have children, if they don't have children. So that's another one way to look at one snapshot of this.
Great, thanks, Mindy. We had another question come in. Does your analysis take into consideration property taxes? In some areas, Illinois in particular, property tax payments can be equal or greater than the mortgage amount. And that's another, I think, really insightful question. We do use an estimate for property taxes when we calculate what a monthly homeownership cost would be in this analysis. It's been a real challenge in trying to collect data metro area to metro area, because jurisdictions within a metro area all have different property tax rates, and the property tax payment will depend on the value of your home. And so we use a proxy to give a little bit of a sense, but as this questioner indicated, there's a great deal of variation that can have a huge impact on housing affordability. This is often a real challenge when you're looking at older adults. So in this case, we're talking more specifically about workers, but if you look at some of the other research that's been done on the housing needs of older adults, it can be a real challenge for older adults who've paid off their homes and no longer have mortgage payments but struggle to afford their property taxes or their utilities. And so I think it's a great point that it's not just the cost of a home or a mortgage, but the associated cost of home ownership that can be a challenge. We had a question that came in that we sort of touched on earlier. It's first, is it possible to look at the data for two-earner households? So as I mentioned, currently you can kind of do your own back-in-the-envelope calculation, but this is something that we'll write down as a good suggestion going forward. And then the second question the person posed was, when you mention impediments to home ownership, do you think that student loan debt is having a significant impact? And I think that's a great question because I think there's been a lot of discussion in the media about the role of student loan debt and home buying among millennials in particular. There's no, I think, definitive answer on that I have seen. However, I do think it's instructive. There have been some recent studies on delinquency and income associated with loan debt amounts. And the recent studies that I've seen indicate that there is actually not a correlation between the high loan debt and defaults or even lower income. In fact, typically these studies have found that high student loan debt seems to translate into higher income. So that, I think, is an interesting question. However, I think there's an element that hasn't been explored, which is the impact this has on the psychology and the individual decision-making of millennials and others, and the fear of taking on too much loan debt. So that's an area that still needs to be explored. My impression, and Mindy, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, is that student loan debt alone is not responsible for the delays in home ownership among millennials. I think it's a real complicated mix that Mindy started to talk about.
Yeah, we haven't found anything that shows, like Jenna said, a significant impact of student loan debt. And also in a lot of cases, it's pretty fairly well managed. What we identify in the report, what we read the most about are the other kind of factors: the low incomes, the difficulty finding jobs, high transportation costs is another one we didn't mention, but that's often a factor at play in higher cost metro areas. So it's probably a good mix. It's probably not a huge factor, student loan debt.
One of the things that Mindy did a great job of exploring in the report, too, is when you think about when most millennials enter the job market, they entered really at the peak of this housing crisis and faced some really challenging employment prospects. And so I think some of the recent research has indicated that employment rates among millennials have improved, but they're not necessarily the jobs or the careers that people want to be in. And that might have some impact as well on their decisions about housing. We have another question that came in. It's, has NHC heard of any programs that entices baby boomers out of their current homes, thereby making the supply available to millennials? That's a really interesting question that I know has been talked about more in the context of housing solutions for older adults. So many people who are thinking about the older adults housing needs of the baby boomer generation have really latched onto this mismatch that in a lot of housing markets you have baby boomers and other older adults that are still living in the homes where they may have raised a family, and these are homes that aren't being able to be put on the market for sale because they're currently occupied. Now, there's a lot of complicated reasons why this might be. A lot of people want to stay in their home, want to age in their home, and don't want to leave. But I do think there are many instances in which you do have baby boomers and other older adults who struggle to find a different kind of housing that meets their needs. So I think there are many people who want to leave the home they had owned for a time and downsize. They may really struggle to find a condo or an apartment or a smaller home that is affordable to them but also accessible and really would meet their needs as they age. And so I think the challenge is thinking about the whole spectrum of housing needs, it's important to think about millennials, but it's also important to think about all the generations. They're at different points in their life and have different housing needs, and we need to think globally about our housing supply and where there's a mismatch, not just in prices, but also in types. So I think that's a really interesting question. So I haven't heard of a program in particular, but I do think it's certainly something that has a lot of potential. We also have a question that came in. Do you also report on the percentages of workers who are housing cost burdened in each metro area? I know it's available census data, but I'm wondering if you incorporate this into your tool. We do not incorporate this into our Paycheck to Paycheck tool. However, we have another annual report called Housing Landscape, in which we specifically look at housing cost burden and severe housing cost burden for working households. And we do have metro level data for that as well as state level data. And I think that's another important way of looking at housing affordability, is considering who is already paying more than they can afford. So that's a great question. We have another question. Is there a way to use the Paycheck to Paycheck information to see what kind of assistance, how much of a down payment assistance, loan buy down would be needed in any of the 208 metropolitan areas? That's a really great question. We have not explored that, and that is something that I think we might want to look into in the future. And if you have any more thoughts about what elements would be helpful, please feel free to share those. Okay, we have another question. Where does it state what the assumptions are for the data? That's a great question. We have that information on our website. So when you go to the Paycheck to Paycheck page from the www.nhc.org, we have one of the links on those first landing pages is to our methodology, where we line out all of the assumptions that we made about how we calculate the home buying costs and the rent costs and where we're finding this home price data and income data. So we'll also send a link out with our follow-up so you can go straight to our methodology and find out how we do our analysis. We had another question. Might homeownership and financial management training be configured for college and high school students in preparation for homeownership? That's a really interesting question, and I think something that is starting to be explored more by researchers. There's been a lot of really interesting research into home buying counseling and the effectiveness in reducing defaults, particularly when you're considering low and moderate income households. And then I think there's been some really interesting work started by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau on just broader financial management training. I went to a meeting a few months ago in which they were describing some of their initiatives to incorporate financial literacy into public education programs. And so thinking about how you teach children basic financial management skills so that even if they might not necessarily be getting it at home, they're getting it at school, and so by the time they're thinking about college or home buying, they've got a really solid foundation. Then we had another question come in. Any thought of how higher interest rates are going to affect the affordability of housing in the coming year, both owner and rental? That's a really interesting question. We haven't done any work projecting that. We generally don't do that much work around projections, but I think it's an important consideration. There are economists who have a much better grasp of this than I do on how these interest rates are or are not influencing home buying behavior. Interest rates have been historically low, but that alone has not been enough to really move the needle on home buying among millennials. But as you point out, the alternative of rising interest rates will certainly not help the matters either. And so I think that's a really important question for us to wrestle with, is how rising interest rates will influence home buying and how that's going to change region to region, and then what impact that has on renting. As Mindy mentioned, and pipe in if you have more, there's a really challenging dynamic now as the rental population is growing, creating a lot of pressure on rent prices. And the higher the rents go, the harder it is to save up to buy a home, if that is your ultimate goal.
Yep, I mean, that summarizes it. And I think that kind of speaks to the need for more programs for, particularly for first-time home buyers, down payment assistance, or at least something to help make that first push. That can be a real challenge, especially to this generation, having difficulty finding jobs and jobs that pay well enough.
Thanks, Mindy. So it looks like our questions have kind of dried up for the moment, but if you have any other questions that come to mind as you sit with this, or as you play around with the tool online, or if you have any ideas for what changes we can make to the tool to make it more useful, please feel free to share with us. We'll be sending you all an email with a follow-up that has a link to this recorded webinar. I'll also include a link to the methodology, as well as the suggestion that one of the attendees made about the article on how zoning influences housing affordability. So at this point, I'd like to thank you all so much for attending, and thank you so much for your great questions and suggestions. This is the kind of information we find very helpful when we think about what kinds of resources practitioners would find useful. And thank you again so much to the National Association of Realtors for sponsoring this webinar, as well as others that we've put on. They've been a great support in trying to get out tools and information to practitioners and really start to tackle housing affordability challenges. So with that, I'd like to wish you all happy holiday season, and we hope to see you on our next webinar. Thank you so much.